December 1944. The Ardennes. Fog crawls across a snow-packed field somewhere east of St. Vith, and a King Tiger commander scans the tree line through his optics. He is 29 years old. His frontal armor is 150 millimeters of sloped steel, the thickest on any tank in the world. Every intelligence briefing he has received since summer has told him the same thing. American mobile anti-tank weapons stop at 76 millimeters. At ranges beyond 1,000 yards, he is untouchable. He is wrong. He has been wrong for almost 3 months. So have hundreds of German tank commanders before him, from Aachen, from the Ruhr, from the Hürtgen Forest. They simply have not lived long enough to learn it. Somewhere behind a low stone wall on the far side of that field, an American crew is watching him through the sight of a weapon their own army spent 2 years refusing to build. A weapon their intelligence officers have been ordered to keep quiet about. A weapon that, on paper, in Berlin, does not yet exist on this battlefield. The barrel is 90 millimeters wide. The gunner behind it is 22 years old. He is from a farm town in Iowa, or a coal patch in Pennsylvania, or a machine shop in New Jersey. He has been in this war for 7 months. He has already watched 3 friends die inside American armor that could not do what his new gun is about to do. He does not know it yet. But in the next 15 seconds, he is about to change what winning a tank duel means in the United States Army. This is the story of how that gun got there, and how the German army spent an entire winter dying to a weapon it never knew was on the battlefield. August 7th, 1944, a sunken lane east of the Norman village of Morton. The apple trees are still heavy with unripe fruit, and the morning mist has not yet burned off the fields. A Sherman from the 743rd Tank Battalion shudders to a halt behind a row of trunks. 5 men inside. The commander is 23 years old. His gunner is 19. Neither of them has slept more than 4 hours in the past 2 nights. 300 yards east, through gaps in the hedge, they can see them. Panthers, 5, maybe 6, moving in column along the road from St. Barthélemy. Long guns, sloped glacis plates, the distinctive rectangular turrets that every American crewman in Normandy has learned to fear on sight. The gunner finds the lead tank in his sight. The range card strapped to his thigh reads 900 yards. He centers the reticle just below the turret ring. He fires. The 75 millimeter shell leaves the barrel at 2,000 feet a second. It crosses the distance in about 3 seconds. It strikes the Panther's frontal plate at a shallow angle. It bounces off. A pale orange spark, a flash of bright metal. The Panther keeps moving. The commander screams a single word into the intercom. Back. But the driver's reverse gear is too slow. The Panther's long 75 has already begun to traverse. It fires from 1,200 yards. The shell punches through 3.5 inches of American armor as if it were folded canvas. 5 men, perhaps 3, will live long enough to crawl out. Across the entire Morton front that morning, the same scene repeats itself in different fields and different lanes. American crews watching their shells skip away like flat stones across cold water. German crews taking their time, choosing their shots. By nightfall, the Americans will still hold the ground. The German counteroffensive, Operation Luttich, will fail not because American tanks outfought German ones, but because American artillery, American air power, and American numbers grind the attack to a halt long before it reaches its objectives. But the tank-to-tank arithmetic of that single day is what reaches the desks of officers far behind the line. And the reports keep saying the same things. Ammunition ineffective at observed range. Vehicle lost to single-round frontal aspect. The men reading them do not need a metallurgist to explain the problem. There is, however, a gun that can solve it. It exists. It is being manufactured in Michigan at this very moment, and it has not been allowed anywhere near the front line. To understand why, we need to go back nearly 3 years to a quiet room in the Pentagon and to a man who, more than any other single American officer, decided how the United States Army would fight tanks. His name was Leslie James McNair, 61 years old that summer, small, quiet. His eyes and his hearing had been damaged by an artillery burst in the First World War, and they had never fully recovered. He was a lieutenant general. He was the commander of Army Ground Forces. Every tank destroyer battalion in the United States Army answered to his doctrine. And that doctrine held one central conviction above all others. Tanks were not built to fight other tanks. Tanks, McNair believed, existed to exploit breakthroughs, to shoot up infantry, to burn supply columns. When enemy armor appeared, a separate force built for exactly one purpose was supposed to find it and kill it. Fast, open-topped, lightly armored, meant to ambush, fire twice, and vanish before the enemy could return fire. Not built to slug it out with a Panther at 400 yards. On paper, in a Pentagon conference room in 1941, it was elegant. By the summer of 1944, it was falling apart. Because the Germans did not read American doctrinal manuals. They refused to fight the way McNair had predicted. They defended in depth with dug-in anti-tank guns instead of the massed armor formations his doctrine had been built to ambush. They counterattacked with Panthers that outranged and outgunned every mobile weapon he had provided. That spring, ordnance officers had proposed something simple. Strip the 75 out of the Sherman. Replace it with a 90. McNair refused. He cited Aberdeen Proving Ground test data from 1943, showing the 76 penetrating Panther armor at what should have been adequate combat ranges. What those tests had not shown, what nobody discovered until real Panthers appeared in real French fields, was that German armor plate was hardened in a way that caused American shells to shatter on impact rather than punch through. Aberdeen data had been collected against test plates that simply did not behave the way real Panther armor behaved in combat. Data was wrong. The doctrine built on top of it was wrong. And on a hot July afternoon in 1944, Leslie McNair still did not know that. He flew to Normandy on July 25th to watch Operation Cobra, the breakout he had helped design, executed at full scale. Cobra opened with a bombing raid by the 8th Air Force. More than 1,500 heavy bombers over a narrow strip of German front line near the village of La Chapelle. Some aircraft released early. A bomb dropped short, roughly 900 meters short. Others followed the same error. The bombs fell among American positions of the 9th and 30th Infantry Divisions and into the observation area where Lieutenant General Leslie McNair had taken cover in a slit trench. A bomb landed beside it. The crater American engineers found afterward was more than 3 meters deep. McNair was identified only by the 3 silver stars on his collar and his West Point class ring. He was the highest-ranking American officer killed in combat in the European theater in the entire Second World War, killed by his own Air Force. His funeral was held in secret 2 days later. Only a handful of generals attended: Bradley, Hodges, Patton. Eisenhower was told but did not come. The deception plan required that the Germans continue to believe McNair was alive and preparing to lead a fictional army group aimed at the Pas-de-Calais. He was buried at the Normandy American Cemetery under a false name for the first 2 weeks, so the Germans would not learn what had happened. His death did not create the M36. That program belonged to another man, Major General Andrew Davis Bruce, a First World War veteran and the head of Tank Destroyer Command, who had spent the interwar years pushing the tank destroyer concept against considerable institutional skepticism of his own. Bruce had already gotten the first M36's rolling off the assembly line that spring, months before McNair's death. What McNair's death removed was the broader institutional resistance to upgunning American armor. The Sherman 90mm proposal he had blocked got revisited. M36 deliveries to Europe slowed by training schedules and logistical hesitations rooted directly in his own doctrine began at last to accelerate. The man who had insisted existing the guns were good enough was in the ground at the Normandy American Cemetery. The guns that were not good enough were finally going to be replaced. The gun itself was not new. In the late 1930s, the Army had gone looking for a replacement for its aging 3-inch anti-aircraft gun. Enemy aircraft were flying higher and faster than the older weapon could reach. What the Ordnance Department produced was the 90mm M1 anti-aircraft gun, in production by 1940, guarding ports and airfields from Hawaii to Long Island by 1942. It threw a 24-pound shell at 2,800 feet a second, up to 34,000 feet of altitude, designed from its first blueprint to look at the sky. Sometime in the early summer of 1942, the exact date and the exact person are lost, an ordnance engineer noticed something. The velocity that drove a 90mm shell to 34,000 feet of altitude would also, aimed horizontally, drive it through nearly any tank then in existence on the ground. The Army's first attempt to use that insight was a rushed mounting called the T-53, a 90mm gun, stuck on an open platform at the rear of a Sherman chassis, approved for production in a panic in August 1942 over the Tank Destroyer Force's own objections that the design was too hurried. It failed, exactly as the objections predicted. The Ordnance Department went back to the drawing board. In October 1942, they tried mounting the 90mm gun in a newly designed turret on the existing M10 tank destroyer hull. That combination worked. The project was designated T-71. Take the 90, discard the M10's existing turret entirely, design a larger one to hold it. The new turret was open-topped by deliberate choice. A closed design would have added more than 2 tons the strained chassis could not absorb. The trade-off was clear, and it was harsh. The crew would be exposed to artillery airbursts and to infantry firing down from upper-story windows. The benefit was a weapon that, on paper, could reach out and touch a Tiger at 2,000 yards. The first T-71 prototype was completed in March 1943. It was tested at Aberdeen against 30-degree homogeneous steel plates, 5 inches thick, 6 inches thick, 7 inches thick. The gun punched through everyone against the actual front of an actual King Tiger at actual combat ranges. The truth would prove considerably more complicated. That lesson was still more than a year away. Standardized as the 90mm gun motor carriage M36 in June 1944. Into series production at the Fisher Body Grand Blanc Tank Arsenal in Michigan that same spring. By July, more than 100 had been built. By August, more than 300. None of them were in Europe yet. The reason was bureaucratic. A new vehicle required new training, new ammunition stockpiles, new logistical planning. Army moved with the patience of an institution that had not yet been embarrassed enough to hurry. Meanwhile, in Normandy, and now in the forests along the German frontier, American crews kept dying in burning Shermans and disabled M10s. The Germans were losing tanks at a far higher overall rate. American industry could absorb almost any number of losses. But at the level of individual crews and individual engagements, the Germans were still winning more often than they lost. A single Panther in a good hedgerow could kill 4 Shermans, 5 Shermans, before an artillery shell or a flanking shot finally caught it. That was the arithmetic of the summer of 1944. That was the arithmetic the Ordnance Department, with McNair finally in the ground, had permission to change. The first M36's reached the European theater in the last week of September, offloaded at Cherbourg and Antwerp. Sent forward by rail and truck convoy to existing tank destroyer battalions that had spent the summer fighting in M10 Wolverines. The 776th, the 703rd, the 654th, the 804th, the 644th. Numbered units whose names meant little to anyone outside the men who had served in them. Men who were, that October, about to test a weapon that only a narrow circle of ordnance officers fully understood, and who had been given, along with their new guns, a single quiet instruction from First Army. Do not let the Germans understand what they are facing. Plain language. The Germans do not yet know what is coming. Keep it that way. The crews noticed the resemblance to their old M10s immediately. Same hull, same tracks, same driver's compartment. Only the turret was different. Larger. Squarer. The barrel projecting from it slightly longer, slightly thicker than the 76 they had been firing for the past 4 months. The men who climbed inside for the first time, some pulled off the line for a few days of familiarization, others brand new replacements, straight off the boat. Boys who had never sat inside any tracked vehicle at all were shown the gun and told it was a 90. Several of them laughed. For 4 months, they had absorbed the hard way in burning hedgerows from Ken to Aachen, the lesson that their guns could not kill what was hunting them. The idea that the army had quietly produced a weapon that changed the math sounded, on first hearing, like one more rumor in a war already full of them. Training was brief. A few rounds fired at salvaged German hulks dragged to the edge of a field, a handful of practice traverses, a short briefing on the new ammunition, and then back to the line. They were not told the whole truth about the gun. Nobody was. Not the sergeants, not the platoon leaders, not the captains. First Army had classified the deployment tight. The Germans were not to know. To understand why an intelligence service with genuinely skilled analysts could be told about a new weapon and simply not see it, we need to walk into the room where the seeing was supposed to happen. Fremde Heere West, Foreign Armies West, the section of the German General Staff responsible for assessing everything the Western Allies fielded. Located in Berlin, in the same building complex on Türpitzufer, where officers had once tried to kill Adolf Hitler the previous July. By the autumn of 1944, that building was under nearly continuous bombardment. The Royal Air Force by night, the United States Army Air Forces by day, windows blown out, roofs collapsed. Whole departments evacuated to farmhouses in the countryside outside the city. The analysts kept working. They worked from reconnaissance photographs, taken at high altitude, showing American vehicles in motor pools and staging areas from several thousand feet up. An analyst studying a magnified print could make out a hull shape, turret outline, sometimes the faint suggestion of a gun barrel. But at that distance, he could not tell a 90-millimeter barrel from a 76. The physical difference is a matter of centimeters. So the analyst compared what he saw against his existing catalog. He found a match to the M10 Wolverine, or to the newer variant he had already been told carried the same gun as the M10, and he logged the report. The file confirmed what the file already said. Psychologists would later give this a name: confirmation bias, the tendency of any analytical system, human or institutional, to find what it already expects to find. And it happened over and over, all through October, all through November, all through the first weeks of December. The vehicles rolling into the front lines opposite them carried 90 millimeters of destruction inside the turret ring. And Berlin kept writing 76 in the file. The first M36 to fire in anger did so somewhere in the rolling farmland along the German border in the 3rd or 4th week of October 1944. The exact time, the exact platoon, the exact village, those are lost. The battalion records are incomplete. The men who could have told us mostly did not survive long enough to be asked. But we know the shape of it, because it happened again and again all across the frontier over the following weeks, in engagement after engagement that filled the after-action reports of the 776th, the 702nd, the 703rd, the 814th, a German column of Panthers and assault guns moving through open ground in support of a local counterattack, an American tank destroyer platoon concealed behind a hedgerow or a stone wall or the burned-out shell of a Belgian farmhouse, the lead Panther closing on the American position, 1,200 yards, 1,000, 900. 4 months of combat instinct telling the platoon leader to wait. Wait until the Germans close to under 500 yards, under 400. Even then, it might not penetrate. Even then, it might just skip off, the way it always had, and give away his position for nothing. He looks at the new gun instead. He gives the order. The shell crosses the distance in under 2 seconds. It strikes low on the hull side, just behind the turret ring. For a fraction of a second, nothing seems to happen. Then the turret hatch blows off its hinges. A flame, perhaps 30 feet long, shoots straight up out of the hull. Black smoke begins climbing into a gray October sky. The platoon leader keys his radio handset and for a long moment does not know what to say. Nobody in his battalion, nobody in his regiment, nobody in his division has ever killed a Panther at that range before. The previous arithmetic of the war simply had not allowed it. The surviving German crews see the lead tank die, and they report the loss up the chain, but they cannot identify who killed it. No muzzle flash visible across the open ground. Only the crack of an arriving shell at a range no American tank destroyer was supposed to be able to reach. The German company commander's after-action report attributes the loss to heavy artillery fire from concealed positions, and his superiors accept the explanation, without question. This is the first crack in the German intelligence picture, and it is also the template for a pattern that will repeat almost daily for the next 10 weeks. German tanks destroyed at impossible ranges by a weapon that, as far as German intelligence is concerned, does not exist. Every loss attributed to something familiar instead. Towed anti-tank guns, artillery firing on a flat trajectory, improved ammunition for a gun everyone already knew about. Anything but the truth. Some of the kills that autumn were extraordinary, and they entered the after-action reports in numbers that officers reading them in Paris could scarcely believe. Near the village of Freilenhoven, on a cold morning in December, an M36 of the 702nd Tank Destroyer Battalion found itself facing a King Tiger 68 tons, the heaviest tank on any battlefield in the world. The American gunner did not try the frontal armor. He knew better. He waited. He let the Tiger keep moving. He watched it expose the flank of its turret at 1,000 yards. He fired. The shell went through the turret side and killed the entire crew. A few weeks later, First Lieutenant Alfred Rose of the 814th Tank Destroyer Battalion sighted a Panther through the telescopic sight of his M36. The range was 4,600 yards. 4,600 yards. That is the outer limit of the sight's calibration. It is more than 2.5 miles. It is farther than any American tank destroyer had ever been asked to fire in serious combat. He fired anyway. The shell arrived. The Panther died. And these were not isolated marvels. They were becoming, slowly, week by week, the new normal on a front where nothing about them was supposed to be possible. The Waffenamt, the German Army Weapons Office, was not blind. It had procedures for exactly this kind of situation. When a new enemy vehicle appeared on the battlefield, engineer teams were supposed to go forward, examine wrecks, take measurements, ship the data back to Berlin for evaluation. Historians believe some of that did happen in the autumn of 1944. Knocked out American vehicles were left on ground the Germans temporarily controlled, and German technical teams almost certainly examined them. Whatever they found should have reached Berlin within days. It did not, because Berlin, by November 1944, was a city that no longer worked the way a capital city was supposed to work. Ministries had been scattered into bunkers. Whole departments had been relocated to Thuringia, to Silesia, to towns whose names no longer mattered to anyone. The Waffenamt itself was in the middle of evacuating part of its operations. The measurements and the photographs and the neat handwritten notes specifying 90 millimeters they sat in wooden crates. The crates moved by truck, then by rail, then sat in waiting rooms in villages where the trains no longer arrived on time, or at all. A paperwork cycle that should have taken days stretched to 4 weeks, then 6. The information was moving, but the front was moving faster. In early December, an unnatural quiet settled over the Ardennes. The Americans holding that stretch of line were, in most cases, tired. The 28th Infantry Division had been ground down in the Hurtgen forest and sent to a quiet sector to rest. The 106th Infantry Division had only just arrived from the United States and had never seen a German soldier. Tank destroyer battalions were scattered across the front. Some experienced, some brand new, some equipped with the M36, most not. Hidden by fog and strict radio silence, the largest armored force Germany would ever assemble in the West was moving into position on the other side of the line. 3 armies, 25 divisions, over 400,000 men, nearly 700 tanks and assault guns, including among the units carrying the heaviest end of the breakthrough, the King Tigers of Heavy SS Panzer Battalion 501, 68 tons each. Frontal armor 150 millimeters thick, sloped at 50 degrees. Long 88 millimeter guns capable of killing any Allied vehicle at any range from which that vehicle could fire back. Their crews believed, with reason, that they were driving the most formidable tanks on Earth. They also believed, on the basis of every intelligence briefing they had received in the previous 6 months, that American mobile anti-tank weapons capped out at 76 millimeters. At 5:30 on the morning of December 16th, 2,000 German guns opened fire along an 85-mile front. 90 minutes later, the tanks began to roll. The commander of Heavy SS Panzer Battalion 501 that morning was SS Obersturmbannführer Heinz von Westernhagen. He was 33 years old. He had been born in Riga in 1911 into a family that had been driven out of the city twice, once by the Russians, once by the Bolsheviks. He had joined the SS in the interwar years, been decorated for bravery in Greece, fought at Kharkov and at Kursk. And at Kursk, in the summer of 1943, a shell fragment had opened a wound in his skull that had never truly healed. He was, by December 1944, a sick man. Chronic headaches, sleep he could not find. His brother, serving under him in the same battalion, would later say there was nothing left of him, and yet he kept driving himself. Kept fighting a war he must have known could not be won. His King Tigers rolled west that morning under the command of a man who could barely stand upright without pain. Racing ahead of him was another SS officer, 29 years old, handsome, photogenic, a former adjutant to Heinrich Himmler, SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Pieper. His mission Kampfgruppe Pieper was simple to describe and nearly impossible to execute. Take the point of the entire offensive, race west. Seize a bridge over the Meuse River near Huy. Hold it until the follow-on SS Panzer Corps could pass through and drive on Antwerp, along narrow Belgian country lanes threading through villages named Stoumont, Cheneux, Stavelot. Lanes and bridges, his King Tigers, at 68 tons apiece, were often too heavy to use at all. Burning fuel at a rate German planners had counted on replacing with captured American depots they never actually captured. Meanwhile, 40 miles to the south, the town of St. Vith sat at a crossroads. 5 roads meeting in one small Belgian town. And in the kind of war Germany was trying to fight, a war of speed and breakthrough, those 5 roads were everything. Without St. Vith, the German timetable came apart. With it, the 6th Panzer Army could pour west toward the Meuse in a torrent the thin American defenses could not hope to contain. By the morning of December 17th, German armor was driving hard for the town. Defending it was a patchwork of the newly arrived 7th Armored Division. Survivors filtering back from the shattered 106 Infantry Engineers. Military police, broken artillery crews, anyone with a rifle put into the line. Attached to the 7th Armored was a mix of M10s and the new M36's. Crews of those M36's, many of them holding their new gun for only 6 or 8 weeks, found themselves on the morning of the 18th looking through their sights at King Tigers advancing in columns through the fog. They had no air support. None was coming for days. The weather had grounded the 8th Air Force. It would not clear until the 23rd. They did it the only way that made sense on that ground, hull down behind hedgerows, in the burned-out shells of barns, letting the lead Tiger close to 1,500 yards or less before firing. A 90mm round at that range against a King Tiger's frontal armor did not always penetrate. Sometimes it did not penetrate at all, but it almost always made the German column stop, deploy, hunt for the source of fire. And while it was stopping and deploying and hunting, the American crew was already backing out of position, repositioning 200 yards down the line, ready to fire again from a new direction. St. Vith held for 6 days. It should have held for 2, and the delay it imposed cracked the German timetable open like an egg. Nearly 20 years later, in 1964, the German commander of the 5th Panzer Army, General Hasso von Manteuffel, would tell an interviewer that he had believed at the time that he was facing an entire American corps at St. Vith. He was not. He was facing the 7th Armored Division, some scattered infantry survivors, and a handful of tank destroyer platoons with a weapon he did not know they had. While St. Vith held in the south, the fight to the north was unfolding along Pieper's Path. By December 23rd, his column was strung out across miles of Belgian countryside. American infantry closing from the north, American armor from the south. American tank destroyers, some of them M36's, firing into it from positions the Germans, pinned by terrain and fuel exhaustion, could no longer maneuver to suppress. On December 23rd, the weather had finally cleared. American P-47 Thunderbolts came down on the villages of L'Église and Stoumont in waves. Rockets, 500-pound bombs, strafing runs that left long lines of glittering brass in the snow. Pieper's parked Tigers made magnificent targets. After dark on the 23rd, he ordered the remnant of his column, a few hundred men on foot, to abandon their vehicles and break out east through the woods. Before dawn on Christmas Eve, they were gone. Almost 40 armored vehicles were left behind, most of them intact and simply out of fuel. He got out. Von Westernhagen got out. Von Westernhagen would live another 3 months. At almost the same hour, Pieper's men were slipping east on foot. Further south, the town of Mannheim fell to the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, pushing west toward Liège. But just beyond it, at the village of Grand-Mesnil, a small American force held. Among them were M36's of the 703rd Tank Destroyer Battalion. Through the late hours of Christmas Eve and the cold gray morning of Christmas Day, they engaged the lead elements of the SS armor at ranges between 500 and 1,500 yards. Hitting, pulling back, hitting again from new ground. They lost some of their own to German return fire, to Panzerschreck teams at close range, to the sheer terror of holding a road they were not supposed to be able to hold. They killed Panthers, and they killed Panzer IVs in numbers German commanders found difficult to comprehend. A German after-action report written within hours of the engagement blamed the unusually high penetration on possible British tungsten core ammunition. Tungsten cores, a closely held British technical secret, something German intelligence already had a file on, which made it a far easier conclusion to reach than the actual unlogged truth. German panzer crews in the final days of the offensive were told at all levels to keep greater standoff distances and to distrust American tank destroyers at every range. Good advice, for entirely the wrong reason. The gun killing them was not a 76 firing a magic round. It had been a 90 all along. By early January 1945, the German offensive had collapsed back on itself. Fuel exhaustion finished what American firepower had begun. Across the snow-covered Ardennes lay the wreckage of an army that would never again take the field at full strength. Tigers and Panthers abandoned where their engines had died, or blown up by their own crews with the last grenades in their pouches. Turret hatches left hanging open, long guns pointing at nothing in particular. Sometime in the first weeks of January, in some bunker or requisitioned farmhouse on the eastern sides of the line, the truth finally caught up with the German intelligence system. The measurements, the photographs, the technical notes delayed by months of bombed rail lines and evacuated departments and paperwork sitting in crates in villages where the trains no longer arrived. All of it finally coming to rest on someone's desk. We do not know that officer's name, but the sentence that would have crossed his mind is not hard to guess. 90 millimeters, not 76. The M36 tank destroyer, the vehicle his crews had been dying to since October, carried a 90 millimeter gun. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a man reading news he should have received a long time ago. This report was the after-action of a 4-month institutional failure. Confession of a system that had photographed a new American vehicle and looked straight at it, and seen the old one. By the second week of January, German Panzer units in the West were quietly told to assume American tank destroyers now carried heavier guns than previously reported, to keep greater standoff distances, to avoid frontal exposure at long range. By the time that instruction reached the front, 3 weeks later, the German Panzer Arm in the West had already lost most of its remaining offensive strength. The information tactically valuable to perhaps a few hundred surviving crews was, in every other sense, 3 months too late. There was not time in January of 1945 for German officers to dwell on it. The Americans were already moving toward the Rhine. On the morning of March 7th, 1945, a forward detachment of the American 9th Armored Division reached the western bank of the Rhine near a town called Remagen and found the Ludendorff Bridge still standing. German demolition charges had failed to fully detonate for reasons historians still argue over. An American infantry lieutenant rushed under fire before the next attempt could be made. The 656th Tank Destroyer Battalion, with its M36's, was among the first armored units across. The bridge groaned and shifted under each set of tracks. It did, in fact, collapse 10 days later, killing 28 American engineers. But by then, pontoon and treadway bridges had already made the collapse irrelevant. The Rhine had been jumped. By March of 1945, the M36 was, in every sense, simply a weapon. No longer secret, no longer hidden. Its 5.5 months of anonymity finally over. 2 things need saying before this story ends, because they change the meaning of everything that came before. The first is about the gun itself. When post-war ordnance officers compiled the Aberdeen technical data against the actual after-action reports from Europe, a clearer and considerably less cinematic picture emerged. The standard M82 armor-piercing round fired from the 90mm M3 gun could penetrate roughly 120 millimeters of sloped armor at 500 yards, about 108 at 1,000, about 90 at 2,000. Now set those numbers against a King Tiger. 150 millimeters of frontal glacis, sloped at 50 degrees. Effective thickness against a horizontal shot close to 230 millimeters. A turret front around 180 millimeters, close to vertical. Standard M82 round fired at 2,000 yards could not penetrate any frontal aspect of a King Tiger. Could not do it at 3,000 yards either. At that range, it could barely scratch the turret side. The newer tungsten core HVAP round was more powerful. It could, in fact, defeat a King Tiger's frontal armor, but only under about 1,000 yards, at favorable angles, with a precisely placed shot, and it was rarely available in quantity. Popular image of the M36 calmly reaching across 3,000 yards of open ground and punching neat holes through Tiger turrets is, in plain terms, a myth. The real kill zone against heavy German armor sat much closer, roughly 800 to 1,500 yards, and it usually required a shot at the side or the rear, where the armor was thinner, where the angle was more forgiving. The men who actually fired those shots knew this. They had learned it the way soldiers always learn, the hard way, one wreck at a time. The second thing is harder to say plainly. In the year after the war ended, the General Board of the United States Forces European Theater, a body established by General Order 128, dated June 17, 1945, sat down in Germany to compile the lessons of the war. Officers interviewed surviving tank destroyer crewmen. They reviewed thousands of after-action reports. They cross-referenced kill claims against captured German records. One finding recorded in that board's report was unexpected. The M18 Hellcat, the smaller, faster tank destroyer, with only a 76mm gun, had achieved the highest kill-to-loss ratio of any American armored vehicle in the war. 526 kills claimed, a ratio of more than 2 enemy vehicles destroyed for every M18 lost. The M36 had a bigger gun. The M18 had the legs. 55 miles an hour on a good road. Small silhouette, torsion bar suspension. It could be somewhere, and then not be somewhere in the space of a single German breath. In the kind of war these men had actually fought, ambush, displacement, brief flashes of intense violence in narrow lanes and half-frozen fields, the legs sometimes mattered as much as the gun did. I do not think that finding fits the post-war mythology at all, and I think that mismatch is worth sitting with for a moment, rather than smoothing over. The version of the story that got retold in books and documentaries for 80 years says that bigger guns won the war, that the M36 was an unambiguous triumph, that every additional millimeter of armor penetration brought soldiers closer to home. The actual men who crewed these vehicles when they were finally interviewed, decades later, at oral history centers around this country, tended to say something more complicated. That surviving mattered more than killing, that the M36 was a good weapon, but it was not the only weapon. And it was not the weapon that killed the most Germans on the Americans' side of the line. That, in a war that was already ending by the time they got there, they were mostly just trying to see the next spring. They mostly did not contradict the legend in public. They mostly just went quiet when it was told. By May of 1945, post-war historians estimate the M36 accounted for a meaningful share of the German heavy armor destroyed in the West during its months in service. The exact number varies depending on which sources you trust and which battalion reports you count. What is certain is this. Across the whole war in Europe, 39 American tank destroyer battalions destroyed approximately 1,344 German tanks and assault guns. The best single battalion, the 601st, which had fought since North Africa, was credited with 105. Not a war-winning number by itself, but part of a much larger arithmetic that Germany could not match, because Germany had wonder weapons that autumn. Genuine ones, jet aircraft, ballistic missiles, the King Tiger itself. None of them saved it. What saved the United States Army was closer to the opposite of a wonder weapon. Country that built over 2,000 M36's, while Germany built fewer than 500 King Tigers. Intelligence system that stayed months ahead of the one it was up against. Thousands of men in numbered battalions with names no one outside the units would ever remember, who kept climbing into open-topped turrets and aiming guns at an enemy they had spent 4 months being told they could not beat. The M36 stayed in service far longer than almost anyone would have guessed. The United States Army used it briefly in Korea in the early 1950s before judging it obsolete against newer Soviet armor and abandoning the open-top tank destroyer concept entirely in favor of true main battle tanks. Passed to America's allies afterward. France used it in Algeria. Yugoslavia kept examples running into the 1990s after re-engining them with Soviet diesels, American tank destroyers with Russian hearts, fighting in the Balkan Wars 50 years after the men who designed them had died of old age. South Korea retained them for decades. The Republic of China Army on Taiwan kept at least 2 operational, by most accounts, into the early 2000s. A weapon designed in Detroit in 1942 to kill King Tigers in Belgian villages, still sitting in a Taiwanese motor pool nearly 60 years after the war that produced it had ended. The nickname Jackson, incidentally, the one you will see in every documentary and read on every plaque, was not a name the men in the turrets actually used. It was assigned after the war. borrowed from the Confederate General Stonewall Jackson by the Ordnance Department, likely for publicity purposes. The soldiers who had fought in the vehicle mostly called it what its official designation called it: 90mm Gun Motor Carriage, M36, or most often simply the TD, Tank Destroyer. That was the word they used on the radio, in their letters home, in the oral histories they gave decades later when someone finally thought to ask. Not Jackson, not Slugger, not Tiger Tamer, just the TD. Plain word for a plain job. Done, in most cases, by young men who did not particularly want to be doing it, in a cold country a long way from home, against an enemy who did not know for almost 3 months what he was actually facing. If a relative of yours served in a tank destroyer battalion anywhere in this story, the 814th at St. Vith, the 703rd at Grandmesnil, the 72nd at Frialdenhoven, the 656th at Remagen, or any of the numbered units that never made it into a single popular history of the war, I would like to hear whatever he told you about it in the comments below. Because these men mostly never wrote memoirs. They came home, they took jobs, they raised children, they put the war in a drawer, and the record of what they actually did is thinner than it should be. They deserve better than to be forgotten under a nickname they never used.